The miracle doctor won't be a kept man. My heart belongs ashore. Chapter 861. Elder Murphy had just casually raised his wine glass, ready to toast with Fukada again. Suddenly hearing Kiran York's voice, his hand froze in mid-air. Fukada, who had also lifted his glass to toast with Elder Murphy, was so startled that his body shivered, causing him to drop his glass onto the table with a clatter. The crisp sound of the glass hitting the table echoed in the quiet courtyard, drawing everyone's attention. The singing and women's voices stopped instantly, and everyone looked at Fukada. Elder Murphy quickly recovered, stood up, and walked out of the pavilion, his sharp eyes fixed on Kiran. Kiran had been supporting Dale Murphy with his hand on Dale's back. Elder Murphy assumed Kiran had taken Dale hostage, his face darkening with anger. "Kiran, someone of your stature resorting to kidnapping my grandson, don't you find it disgraceful?" Kiran was momentarily taken aback, but then laughed at Elder Murphy's shamelessness. "Killing your grandson is no different from crushing an ant. Do you think I would care?" Elder Murphy's face twisted with anger, wanting nothing more than to stab Kiran. Dale, on the other hand, felt a sense of relief and survival. He had been genuinely afraid Kiran might kill him, but now he realized he might live. "Kiran, what brings you to the Murphy family?" Elder Murphy asked, his voice deliberately cold. "I'm here to ask you something," Kiran replied calmly. "What do you want to ask?" Elder Murphy remained vigilant, eyes fixed on Kiran. "Do you have any more of those large snakes from Kiran Mountain?" Kiran asked seriously. Elder Murphy was puzzled. "Why are you asking about those snakes? I killed one today and got its gallbladder, but someone stole it from me. So, I'm looking for another snake to get another gallbladder," Kiran explained, his eyes full of amusement. Elder Murphy's face changed instantly, filled with shock. Kiran thought to himself, so it wasn't Byron Murphy who stole the gallbladder. Who did? Someone stole the gallbladder? Elder Murphy asked, his voice low and thoughtful. He had coveted the gallbladder himself but didn't take it due to the circumstances. He hadn't expected it to be stolen from Kiran, indicating someone with significant skill. "Raising such a snake is troublesome. Do you think it's easy?" Elder Murphy said, feigning displeasure. "If raising a snake is difficult, then raising a person must be even harder," Kiran said with a sly smile. Elder Murphy didn't understand Kiran's point but responded honestly. "Raising such a python is indeed more troublesome than raising a person, even more so than supporting a family. I think you should experience the difference between raising a snake and a person," Kiran suggested. "What difference?" Elder Murphy asked coldly, his eyes fixed on Kiran. "Let's see if your grandson can be saved if he dies," Kiran laughed, taunting him. "Kiran, don't you dare harm my grandson," Elder Murphy shouted angrily, moving forward to pull Dale away. "Take him. I don't need him," Kiran said, striking Dale on the back. Dale's body, propelled by the force, lunged forward. Elder Murphy, seeing Dale not scream, thought Kiran had gone easy and relaxed. But as soon as his hand touched Dale, he felt a massive force surge through, attacking him. Kiran's strike was meant to pass the force through Dale to Elder Murphy, catching him off guard. Elder Murphy had never expected such a tactic. Unprepared, the force hit him like a giant wave, causing him to vomit blood. Fukada, watching, was terrified into silence, his face pale. Elder Murphy wiped the blood from his mouth, glaring at Kiran. "You're a treacherous person, using such underhanded methods to trap me." Kiran coldly replied, "Isn't this just returning the favor?" "You." Elder Murphy trembled with rage, pointing at Kiran in fury. He knew Kiran was referring to the underhanded ghost palm attack he had used earlier. He hadn't expected Kiran to react so quickly and trap him so easily. "You were lucky to catch Dale. Otherwise, the force in his body would have killed him," Kiran said calmly. Dale's face was filled with fear, realizing how close he had come to death. Elder Murphy, trying to calm his anger and regulate his breath, knew Kiran was right. Without catching Dale, the force would have torn him apart. After a few minutes, Elder Murphy's breathing steadied. He glared at Kiran. "Kiran, you're arrogant. Today, I will kill you." Kiran, unfazed, smiled coldly. "Byron Murphy, I have no intention of fighting to the death. I'm here to ask you something." Elder Murphy, rarely addressed by his full name, replied coldly. "What do you want to know?" "What secrets are hidden in Kiran Mountain?" Kiran asked, eyes fixed on Elder Murphy. "If you want to know, find out yourself. I won't tell you," Elder Murphy sneered. "The Grand Hall houses pythons, and the Kiran Cave has a coffin. Kiran Mountain is truly strange," Kiran said, watching Elder Murphy's face closely. Elder Murphy's face changed dramatically, showing shock. He hadn't expected Kiran to know so much. "I don't want to waste words. Tell me quickly, or your family will have no peace," Kiran said, glancing around at the Murphy family, and then focusing on Dale. That was just an example. Chapter 862, Dale Murphy looked at his grandfather with wary eyes, his face showing fear, afraid of dying. Byron Murphy's face went through several changes, clearly very angry. He snorted coldly, "Kiran York, I hope you recognize reality." "Recognize reality?" Kiran sneered. "You should be the one to recognize it." Kiran looked at Byron with disdain. "You promised me Kiran Mountain, so I have the right to deal with it." Byron's face grew even darker. He had promised Kiran the mountain, thinking the ghost fetus would kill him or the giant snake would eat him. He hadn't expected Kiran to survive. Byron laughed coldly. "I've decided not to give it to you now." Kiran scornfully replied, "You're old and you go back on your word? What does it matter to you? Who can say anything?" Byron responded arrogantly. "If you want to leave here safely, you better leave now or you'll regret it." Kiran was enraged by Byron's arrogance. If it weren't for Sue Walton's warning about Byron's many secrets, he would have already gone on a killing spree. He maintained his composure and said, "Let's see about that." Byron smirked disdainfully. "It seems you have a death wish." Kiran didn't respond. He just gave Byron a cold look. "I think you deserve to die." Enough talk. Byron's anger boiled over and he lunged at Kiran. Kiran's face grew serious. He knew Byron was genuinely powerful. He swung his palm to meet Byron's attack. The Murphy family had never seen Byron in action. The sheer intensity of his killing intent was suffocating, making it hard to breathe. With a loud bang, the air reverberated and the sound roared in their ears. Kiran and Byron stepped back, separating after the clash. Byron stood with his hands behind his back, his face calm and composed. Kiran's expression grew more serious. The exchange left everyone unsure of who had won. "Kiran, given time, you will reach the pinnacle," Byron remarked. Kiran remained silent, watching Byron intently. Byron smirked. "But today you've met your end." The Murphy family cheered, their spirits lifted. "Grandfather, kill that bastard today," Dale shouted, relishing the thought of avenging his humiliation. Byron's gaze locked on Kiran. "Such a pity, your years of cultivation will be wasted." Kiran's eyes suddenly shifted to Fukada. Fukada, thinking Kiran was addressing him, instinctively stood straighter, though his eyes still showed fear. Kiran had already scared him witless. "Byron Murphy, you've become the dog of Sunland," Kiran said contemptuously. Byron laughed instead of getting angry. When the laughter ceased, Byron moved. His body shot towards Kiran like lightning, a blur to everyone watching. Dale cheered excitedly, clapping and shouting, "Grandfather, you're amazing!" "Grandfather, kill Kiran and tear him apart." "Kiran, your end is here." The Murphys were elated, expecting Byron to finish Kiran off. Kiran's eyes were sharp, his expression serious as Byron approached. At less than 3 meters away, Byron leaped, his feet aimed at Kiran's head like swords. Kiran calmly shifted left, his hands forming palms to strike Byron's legs. "Kiran, you've fallen for it," Byron shouted as his hands released a barrage of white light towards Kiran. Hidden weapons? Kiran's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Byron to resort to such a despicable move. His palms were already committed to the strike and couldn't be retracted. "Watch out, Kiran," Aoki Kosner shouted, throwing herself at Kiran to shield him. Thud! Thud! A series of sounds filled the air, followed by blood splattering against the dark night, illuminated by the lights. Aoki screamed, her body falling to the ground. Kiran missed his strike, quickly catching Aoki. Her back was riddled with glowing blue needles. Not only was she injured, but she was also poisoned. Kiran's anger flared. He quickly retrieved an antidote pill and put it in Aoki's mouth. "Kiran, I'm fine." Aoki weakly smiled, trying to reassure him, but black blood spurted from her mouth. Kiran's face was grim. He hadn't expected Byron to be so treacherous. He had thought Byron would rely on his strength to fight honorably. Byron had proven to be a true scoundrel using such underhanded tactics. Kiran's eyes fixed on Byron. Byron ignored Kiran, turning to Fukada. "Fukada, how do you explain this?" Fukada, surprised by Aoki's intervention, had hoped Byron's sneak attack would kill Kiran. Aoki's actions had shattered that hope. "You should die, Aoki Kosner!" Fukada shouted angrily. Aoki, weakened and injured, couldn't respond. Her heart swelled with happiness. She was willing to die for Kiran, the man she admired and worshipped. Kiran, moved by Aoki's devotion, grew even angrier. His eyes flashed with rage as he threw a silver needle. Fukada clutched his throat, unable to speak as blood trickled through his fingers. "The one who should die is you!" Kiran's voice was cold and deadly as he held Aoki, turning to Byron. "From now on, every Murphy will die." Byron was furious, seeing Kiran's audacity in killing Fukada. Leaving here alive will be your problem. Byron moved again, attacking Kiran with deadly intent. Stop! A woman's voice rang from the villa entrance. Byron paused, his attack halted, looking towards the voice. Kate Gannon entered with a group of people. Byron stopped his attack, watching Kate. Byron, put aside your grudge with Kiran for now, Kate commanded. Why should he? Kill Kiran, Dale shouted angrily. Slap! Byron turned and slapped Dale. Chapter 863. Grandpa, why did you hit me? Dale Murphy clutched his burning face, glaring angrily at Byron Murphy. Byron ignored Dale's question and turned his gaze to Kate Gannon and the people she had brought with her. Are you sure you want to get involved in the conflict between Kiran York and me? Kiran, take your people and leave, Kate said, not responding to Byron's inquiry. She looked directly at Kiran. Kiran saw Aoki Kosner's pale face and severe injuries, knowing she could die at any moment. He quickly pulled out silver needles and inserted them into several points on her body. Then, he picked her up and turned to Byron. Stay alive! I will take your life! Kiran nodded to Kate, his eyes showing gratitude. This was the first time Kate saw a different expression in Kiran's eyes, and it filled her with a sense of happiness. She clenched her fists, determined to help Kiran. Grandpa York is leaving, Dale shouted anxiously, eager to see Kiran dead. Byron Murphy, your grudge with York is suspended for today, Kate reiterated firmly. Although Byron was reluctant, seeing the people Kate had brought, he suppressed his anger. The people with Kate were not highly skilled, but he knew her background and feared the Imperial Dragon behind her. Fighting against the Imperial Dragon meant facing dire consequences. Kiran, holding Aoki, left the Murphy family's villa and hurried back to Lindsay Ludwig's villa. Upon entering the villa, he turned on the living room light and placed Aoki on the sofa. He quickly tore open her clothes to reveal her back, which should have been pale but was now covered in blood. Her back was filled with numerous embedded projectiles resembling countless open eyes. Seeing the embedded projectiles made Kiran's heart ache, and a surge of hatred rose within him. Taking a deep breath, he gently stroked Aoki's hair and murmured, You're such a foolish woman. Which woman who falls in love with you isn't foolish? Yvonne Quinn's voice, filled with grievance, came from the bedroom. Why are you awake? Kiran asked curiously, remembering how he had put her and her sister to sleep with acupressure points. How could I not feel your intense emotional turmoil? Yvonne replied as she approached. She had a white powder in her hand, which she sprinkled on Aoki's wounds. This will help ease the pain and speed up healing, controlling the poison. Kiran didn't thank Yvonne. He focused on treating Aoki's injuries. Aoki's wounds were severe, and she groaned in pain during the treatment. Several times, she even woke up from the pain. Seeing Aoki wake up in pain, Kiran felt hopeful, as it meant she had a chance to survive. Yvonne cradled Aoki's head in her lap and said to the semi-conscious woman, Kiran said he will marry you. Aoki, weak and delirious from the pain, clung to this hope as if it were life-saving water in a desert. Kiran felt Aoki's life force grow stronger, giving him more confidence in saving her. Finally, there was only one crescent-shaped projectile left in Aoki's back, located directly over her heart. It was very deep and had injured her heart. If not for Kiran's medical skills, she would already be dead. However, Kiran couldn't remove this projectile without surgery. It's too late to take her to the hospital. She might die on the way, Yvonne said. You know those quack doctors might kill her instead of saving her. Do you have any Giyu poison that can boost her will to live alive? Kiran asked Yvonne. I've already done my best, you've seen it, Yvonne replied helplessly. Kiran realized that Yvonne's earlier words about him marrying Aoki had been the best medicine. He looked at Aoki, whose head was on Yvonne's lap, and saw she was unconscious. Despite the treatment and goo control, Aoki was getting closer to death. Kiran could remove the projectile with silver needles, but he wasn't sure if Aoki would survive. The injury was to her heart, requiring strong willpower to survive. It's useless. Aoki is hard to save now, Yvonne said, her eyes filled with sorrow and pain, having taken Kiran's pain as her own. Kiran's heart ached like being cut by a knife. He remembered John Moss and the others pursuing Aoki earlier. Such a great woman sacrificed herself for him. It would haunt him forever. I'll take her to the hospital and perform the surgery myself, Kiran said, picking Aoki up and wrapping her as he headed out. Yvonne followed him, driving them to Dragon City Hospital. At the hospital, Kiran told the doctor, the patient is in critical condition. I need to perform the surgery myself. The doctor, seeing Aoki covered in blood, became nervous. Hearing Kiran's request, he shook his head vigorously. No way! Are you here to cause trouble? I'll take full responsibility. Kiran insisted. The doctor still refused. That doesn't matter. You need to leave now. Kiran grew frustrated. We'll pay. We just need to use your equipment. Do you have a medical license? A nurse asked, noticing the silver needles on Aoki's body and guessing Kiran was a traditional medicine practitioner. No, I don't. You're a traditional medicine practitioner trying to perform surgery without a license. How can we trust you? The doctor was furious, thinking Kiran was ridiculous. He's a doctor from York Traditional Medicine Clinic in Bayville, Yvonne introduced. This is Dragon City Hospital, not York Traditional Medicine Clinic in Bayville, the doctor said impatiently, waving them away. Kiran was angry but helpless. Even if he forced his way in, they wouldn't provide the equipment. Mr. York? A surprised voice called out. Kiran turned to see the ailing young Master Wick he had encountered at Byron Murphy's villa. Young Master Wick quickly approached and bowed to Kiran. Hello, Mr. York. Chapter 864. Kiran York was anxious to save lives and had no time to deal with young Master Wick. He simply nodded in acknowledgement and then turned to the doctor. We'll give your hospital 10 million. Just let me use your medical equipment. The doctor was momentarily stunned by the offer of 10 million but shook his head even more vigorously. No, Dragon City Hospital is a reputable institution. How could we allow you to enter and save people like this? After speaking, the doctor glanced at Wick, seemingly trying to make a good impression. Kiran grew increasingly anxious. Yvonne Quinn was about to pull out her phone to call Lindsay Ludwig. Wick asked the doctor, Dr. Fuller, what's going on? This guy doesn't have a medical license. He's a practitioner of traditional medicine. He wants to use our equipment for surgery and do it himself. Isn't that ridiculous? Dr. Fuller's tone was full of dissatisfaction, showing strong principles. A young nurse added with a sneer, 10 million? If we took that, you'd probably end up needing 100 million for compensation. Traditional medicine? Wick's mind raced. He remembered that Kiran had diagnosed him just by looking at his appearance, demonstrating strong diagnostic skills in Western medicine. He had recently been diagnosed with a condition at the hospital, a fortunate early detection that could still be controlled. At that moment, he felt a surge of gratitude towards Kiran. If not for Kiran, he might not have known about his illness. Suddenly, a thought struck him. Could Kiran's medical skills save him? Filled with hope, he turned to Dr. Fuller. Arrange an operating room for Mr. York immediately. Dr. Fuller's face changed instantly, looking troubled. Kiran was momentarily taken aback and looked at Wick. Wick quickly introduced himself. Mr. York, I'm Wick. My father is the director of this hospital. Kiran felt a sense of relief, as if aided by fate. Arrange the operating room now. After I save the patient, I'll cure your illness. Wick's eyes lit up with joy. He hadn't expected Kiran to agree so readily and nodded repeatedly. Thank you, Mr. York. Hearing that Kiran would treat Wick's illness, Dr. Fuller didn't dare obstruct any further and instructed the young nurse, quickly arrange the operating room. The young nurse, intimidated by Wick's status, didn't dare speak and went to make the arrangements. Kiran, holding Kosner Aoki, quickly entered the operating room. He glanced around, noting the comprehensive equipment. After directing the nurses to prepare, he had them leave the room, staying alone. The doctors and nurses were unhappy with Kiran's arrangements but complied due to Wick. Yvonne Quinn, Wick, and others waited outside the operating room. Dr. Fuller and the young nurse also stayed, worried about potential accidents and responsibility. They were under immense pressure, knowing that offending Wick would ruin their careers, but a medical mishap would also get them fired. They were caught in a dilemma, their anxiety mounting. An hour passed and the emergency room door remained closed. Dr. Fuller and the young nurse were sweating with tension. They exchanged anxious glances, both nervous and uneasy. Another 15 minutes passed before the operating room door opened. Kiran emerged, pale and sweaty. The young nurse, nervous, blurted out, "Is the patient dead?" Dr. Fuller, having been on edge, fainted upon hearing the word dead. The scene turned chaotic as others panicked, not knowing what to do. Kiran raised his hand, inserting a silver needle into Dr. Fuller's body. Dr. Fuller let out a low groan, slowly opening his eyes. The tension and anxiety vanished. "Mr. York, how is the patient?" Wick asked expectantly. "She's fine, just needs a few days of rest," Kiran replied weakly, clearly exhausted. "You saved the patient?" Dr. Fuller, having gotten up, looked at Kiran in disbelief. Without waiting for a response, he ran into the emergency room and quickly returned. The young nurse, assuming the worst, asked, "Is she dead?" Dr. Fuller glared at her, then knelt before Kiran. "Miracle doctor, will you take me as a disciple?" Dr. Fuller's dramatic behavior startled the young nurse, who covered her mouth in shock, even surprising Kiran. The young nurse rubbed her eyes and hurried to pull Dr. Fuller up. "Professor Fuller, what are you doing?" Dr. Fuller pushed her away, looking at Kiran. The patient's knife wound reached the heart, yet you saved her. You're a miracle doctor. Though he still had doubts, Dr. Fuller's admiration was evident. The stable readings on the equipment were unforgettable, and his respect for Kiran's skills was profound. Kiran raised his hand, gently helping Dr. Fuller up. I'll need your help with the patient's post-operative care. No problem. We'll do everything we can, Dr. Fuller readily agreed, then pleaded. Will you take me as a disciple? Kiran shook his head slightly. The differences between Western medicine and traditional medicine are too great. Dr. Fuller's face showed regret and disappointment. Wick, however, was filled with joy and hope. Mr. York, your skills are extraordinary. Kiran understood that Wick hoped he would treat his illness. Grateful for Wick's earlier help, Kiran smiled. Your illness isn't urgent. I'll cure it completely in a few days. Thank you, Mr. York, thank you. Wick expressed his gratitude repeatedly. Keep your pants on and stop causing trouble, Kiran advised. Wick blushed, nodding in understanding. Yvonne Quinn approached, offering Kiran a tissue to wipe his sweat. After resting for a while, Kiran returned to care for Kosner Aoki. Dr. Fuller and the young nurse, full of respect and admiration for Kiran, stayed to assist. Kiran spent the night at the hospital, ensuring Kosner Aoki's condition stabilized. The following day, Kosner Aoki slowly opened her eyes. Seeing the white surroundings and remembering the situation, she weakly called, Kiran. Kiran quickly walked over. Tears of joy filled Kosner Aoki's eyes as she looked at Kiran, feeling blessed. Seeing her happy despite being injured, Kiran's heart ached. He gently touched her pale face. You're such a silly girl. Kosner Aoki smiled more brightly but remained silent, simply gazing at Kiran, conveying that everything was worth it. Kiran felt a pang of sorrow knowing how much these women had sacrificed for him. Kiran! At that moment, Lindsay Ludwig's voice sounded urgently from the doorway. Chapter 865. Kiran York pushed open the door of the emergency room. Lindsay Ludwig, dressed in a black, tight-fitting short skirt, quickly walked over. Her long, slender, fair legs were exposed, making her look even more seductive and alluring as she moved. The skirt hugged her upper body tightly, accentuating her curves. However, Lindsay's face was filled with anxiety. Seeing Kiran, she didn't use her usual seductive tactics and directly grabbed his arm. Wendy Kruger's condition has worsened. Last night, she even injured her grandfather. Hearing Wendy's name, Kiran remembered the ghost fetus that would revive tonight. What's the situation now? You said last time she would die in 3 days. I specifically checked on her today. This morning she seemed normal. Lindsay paused and continued, but her grandfather is severely injured and can hardly move. Kiran's eyes narrowed slightly, showing a hint of anger. Yesterday's trip to Kiran Mountain was a waste of time. Inside the room, Aoki overheard their conversation and knew it was urgent. She looked at Kiran and weakly said, I'm fine here, you go ahead. Her gentle voice and faint smile epitomized the softness of Sunland women. Even Lindsay felt an inexplicable sensation upon hearing it. Kiran thought for a moment, then turned back and gently stroked Aoki's face. You mustn't get excited or angry and you can't eat anything for now. Bear with it. Aoki smiled brightly, feeling Kiran's concern. She playfully said, I'll behave, or I'll worry you'll punish me. Kiran chuckled at Aoki's cuteness and patted her forehead, smiling lovingly. I'll be back after handling this. Aoki nodded. Kiran hesitated briefly, then leaned down to kiss her forehead. Aoki, who had dreamed of this moment countless times, was stunned with joyous surprise, her face turning a shy crimson. Rest well and recover quickly, Kiran said before leaving. Aoki's face beamed with happiness, her ears ringing with the words she vaguely heard last night Kiran would marry her. Thinking of Kiran's kiss, her heart melted. Lindsay and Kiran exited and entered the elevator. Lindsay immediately hugged Kiran, raising her beautiful, mature face and looking at him with longing eyes. Kiran smiled and asked, What are you doing? If you can kiss others, why can't you kiss me? Lindsay pouted. Kiran, slightly helpless, adjusted her hair. Last night, Aoki almost died saving me. Last time, I almost killed myself for you. Lindsay blushed and glared at Kiran. Kiran felt a mix of helplessness and complexity. Just one kiss, please, Lindsay pleaded, waving her fair index finger in front of Kiran. Kiran looked at Lindsay's beautiful finger, feeling a desire to take it into his mouth. His heart skipped a beat. Just one, okay? Lindsay begged again. Feeling a bit helpless, Kiran leaned down and kissed Lindsay's forehead. Lindsay's eyes filled with happiness as she responded to the kiss. Just then, the elevator reached the first floor, and the door opened to reveal Yvonne Quinn with breakfast, smiling broadly. Lindsay's face turned beet red upon seeing her sister. Kiran also felt a bit embarrassed. Yvonne, however, was calm and smiled. Should I call you husband or brother-in-law now? Her question made Kiran even more embarrassed. Lindsay, her face red enough to drip, wanted to disappear. She pinched Kiran's side and said, "You pervert! Stealing kisses from me!" Kiran felt helpless. How could he explain that Lindsay had asked for the kiss? He couldn't say anything to provoke her further and just bore it silently. Turning to Yvonne, Kiran said, "Please take care of Aoki Kosner. Your sister and I have something to handle." "Go ahead," Yvonne replied, her smile widening as if implying they had something good to do. Unable to explain, Kiran nodded slightly and left with Lindsay. Yvonne looked at the breakfast in her hand, shrugged and tossed it into the trash, saying, "Feeding the dogs." Even after leaving, Kiran heard Yvonne's comment and couldn't help but touch his chin. What a harsh thing to say. How did he become a dog? Lindsay didn't know about the telepathic connection between Kiran and Yvonne. She was happy, believing that good times were ahead now that Kiran had kissed her and held her. They reached the car and Lindsay sat in the passenger seat, tossing the keys to Kiran. Kiran started the car, buckling his seatbelt while glancing at Lindsay. His eyes landed on her long legs. Feeling his gaze, Lindsay didn't mind and even flaunted her legs a bit, teasingly. Kiran, who hadn't had breakfast, felt his heart skip a beat at the sight. "Want to see more?" Lindsay teased. Kiran averted his eyes, starting the car. "You sisters aren't planning to both be my mistresses, are you?" Lindsay, frustrated by her failed seduction, clenched her fists. "I only like Snow Xander as a wife." Kiran's words made Lindsay see red, feeling like she had a herd of alpacas running through her heart. Glaring at him, she retorted, "We'll see about that." "I'm not falling for your tricks," Kiran retorted. Lindsay, exasperated, grabbed his hand. "Will you stop teasing me?" It was Yvonne's question, not mine. "Do you like me or not?" Lindsay pressed. "I quite like Wendy Kruger," Kiran replied with a mischievous smile. Chapter 866. Lindsay Ludwig was initially teasing Kiran York happily, but upon hearing Kiran's words, she almost burst with anger. She glared at Kiran, her hands clenched into tight fists, and huffed, "Are you trying to infuriate me to death?" Kiran reached out and gently squeezed Lindsay's fair, delicate hand. Lindsay was taken aback, a wave of sweetness washing over her, but she still raised an eyebrow and asked, "Do you think I'm pretty?" Kiran looked at Lindsay's lovely, expectant face and couldn't help but smile. "Since when did you lack confidence in your looks?" "All because you, a heartless man, aren't moved by me," Lindsay said, her face flushed with a mix of grievance and shyness. Kiran laughed and said, "When we meet Wendy Kruger today, I hope you'll be understanding no matter what I do." Lindsay, recalling Kiran's earlier comment about liking Wendy, became instantly vigilant. "You don't really like Wendy Kruger, do you? Can you just say whether you agree or not?" Kiran asked, a bit helpless. Lindsay's eyes showed a hint of grievance, but she replied, "Do as you please. It's your freedom, and I have no right to interfere." Kiran smiled and patted her fair leg lightly. The feeling was wonderful, elastic, and smooth. It was the first time Lindsay had been touched so gently by Kiran. She felt both nervous and excited, her eyes showing a hint of enchantment. "I need to find a way to control her ghost fetus, so I need to make arrangements now." Lindsay, still lost in the sensation of Kiran's touch, nodded blankly. Kiran withdrew his hand and focused on driving, but Lindsay's mind was still lingering on his touch. When they arrived at the Kruger Traditional Medicine Clinic, the doors were closed. Kiran and Lindsay pushed their way in. The entire place was in disarray, with broken bottles and scattered herbs everywhere. Wendy's grandfather, Justin Kruger, was sitting on the floor, bandaged and dazed. "Grandpa Kruger," Lindsay called out, hurrying over. Seeing Lindsay, Justin's eyes welled up with tears. Kiran scanned the room before focusing on Justin. Only a few hours left. Justin didn't lose his temper this time. His eyes were filled with bewilderment. "Grandpa Kruger, Kiran is our only hope now," Lindsay said, looking at Justin. Justin shook his head and looked at Kiran. "Your martial arts are indeed impressive, but you can't save Wendy. You shouldn't get involved." Kiran didn't respond to Justin's words. Instead, he walked to the middle of the messy room and picked up a spirit tablet with the name Nell Donner written on it. "Is this Wendy's mother?" Justin nodded. "Wendy's mother died giving birth to her." "Nell Donner is quite a unique name," Kiran remarked. Justin paused for a moment and said, "Wendy's mother was from Sunland. Her original name was Nile Winter." Justin continued after a brief pause. "I didn't like Sunland people, but I couldn't change their marriage, so I had them change her name to Nell Donner." Lindsay was surprised and looked at Kiran. Kiran remained calm and asked Justin, "Do you feel your son's death was also unjust?" Justin's expression changed instantly, repeatedly staring at Kiran. Lindsay, worried, kept signaling Kiran to stop talking, but Kiran ignored her and continued, "Could this have all been a setup?" Justin's face turned pale upon hearing this. He stood up and looked sharply at Kiran. "Are you saying they deliberately had Niall Winter marry my son to conceive Wendy?" Lindsay was confused by their conversation, her eyes darting between the two men. Kiran remained silent, just staring back at Justin as if encouraging him to think. After several changes in expression, Justin suddenly raised his head and looked at Kiran. "If you're right, the ghost fetus intended to use Niall Winter to be born, but it ended up in Wendy by accident. Correct?" Kiran admired Justin's medical skills and calmness and nodded. "That's what I suspect." Justin's face showed tension and anger. After several changes in expression, he said, "If that's true, they've been plotting this for a long time." Kiran nodded again. Justin was no longer calm. His previously sorrowful face was now filled with anger. "Could it be that old fox, Byron Murphy?" Justin's voice was filled with murderous intent as he spoke. Kiran's face also changed at the mention of Byron Murphy. "Byron Murphy and I were fellow disciples. He went to Sunland to train in martial arts while I stayed in Dragonsland to practice medicine. When he returned from Sunland, he settled down and developed his family. Because of our master-disciple relationship, our families were close. My son often visited his house and became interested in Sunland." Kiran raised an eyebrow. "Did your son also yearn for Sunland?" Justin nodded. "Exactly. He went to Sunland for university and brought back Niall Winter when he graduated." Justin paused, his face showing anger. They had been together for a long time by then, deeply in love. "I opposed their marriage, but couldn't stop them." After a brief pause, Justin continued, "To gain my approval for their marriage, my son repeatedly asked Byron Murphy to persuade me." He looked at Kiran. "In the end, I agreed." Kiran was now certain that Byron Murphy was deeply involved in this matter. The root of the ghost fetus was at Kiran Mountain. The coffin in Kiran Cave and the incense at Kiran Mountain were all related to the ghost fetus. Byron Murphy was ruthless. That was Kiran's assessment of Byron Murphy. Justin remained silent for a full minute before looking at Kiran. "If that's the case, everything can be explained." "If you can understand it, I can find a way to save your granddaughter," Kiran said. Justin shook his head at Kiran. "Spilled water cannot be recovered, and fate cannot be changed." Chapter 867. Justin Kruger glanced in the direction of the room and said, "The ghost fetus inside Wendy Kruger has already formed. It's impossible to control it now." Lindsay Ludwig's face turned pale, and she clenched her fists, looking at Kiran York anxiously for a solution. "You've been trying to control it for so many years. Why not try again now?" Kiran asked Justin. Justin shook his head helplessly. "Although I knew from birth that there was a ghost fetus inside her, I tried various medications and even attempted to use formations to suppress it, but nothing worked. It's not that your formations and medications were ineffective, but rather that there is a powerful force behind it," Kiran said, focusing on Justin. Justin's expression changed several times before he asked, "Is it fate then?" Kiran shook his head. "For such a monstrous being, how can we talk about fate?" Justin did not argue, but his face remained grave. Kiran continued, "The incense at Kiran Mountain Manor has been nourishing this ghost fetus, making it grow faster." "You mean the incense at Kiran Mountain?" Justin's face showed shock. Kiran nodded. "Since you and Byron Murphy are fellow disciples, you should know what he's capable of." Justin fell silent upon hearing this. Kiran didn't interrupt Justin's contemplation. Instead, he observed the Kruger Traditional Medicine Clinic, eventually focusing on Wendy's room. Outside Wendy's room, Justin had set up a 7-star Yang gathering formation. This formation, using the 5 elements along with heaven and earth, was meant to gather Yang energy to suppress the ghost fetus and strengthen Wendy's Yang. From a design perspective, it was logical and the best method to increase Yang energy. However, Justin overlooked one point. The ghost fetus was also absorbing the incense from Kiran Mountain. This incense, too, had Yang energy. Consequently, the ghost fetus was not afraid of Yang energy. The combined Yang energy from Kiran Mountain and the 7-star Yang gathering formation actually accelerated the growth of the ghost fetus. Justin's formation had the opposite effect. "Are you saying Byron Murphy intentionally had this child born in our family?" Justin asked after long contemplation, seeking confirmation from Kiran. Although he had suspected it, he needed verification. "Under the Great Hall of Kiran Mountain, they raise a python, feeding it various animals daily," Kiran replied instead of answering directly. Justin's expression changed several times, and he finally asked, "You mean they raise a python under the Great Hall of Kiran Mountain?" Kiran nodded solemnly. "In such a sacred place, raising a python and feeding it various animals daily. Don't you find that strange?" Justin was extremely shocked, feeling a chill down his spine. This ghost fetus absorbs the incense from Kiran Mountain. But because the Yang energy was too dense, They were afraid that it wouldn't be able to accept it, so they deliberately used the evil spirit of this python to pollute the incense offering. This way, this ghost fetus can better absorb this incense offering, Kiran explained. Justin's face changed several times and he nodded. What you say makes sense and also helps conceal the ghost fetus, protecting it. Kiran nodded and continued. In the Kiran cave at Kiran Mountain there is a black coffin filled with poison. After saying this, he looked at Justin. Justin's expression changed repeatedly. How can such a thing exist? Kiran shook his head, indicating he didn't know. However, he pointed to Justin's 7-star Yang gathering formation and said, "That coffin is controlled by a formation, and the core of the formation is in your home." You mean the ghost fetus is the core of the formation? Justin asked quickly. Kiran nodded. The ghost fetus is not only the core but also enhances the effects of both formations. Can you take me to see the Kiran cave? Justin's curiosity grew and he looked at Kiran. We can bring Wendy along. There might be some surprising discoveries, Kiran suggested. Okay, Justin agreed without hesitation. Lindsay quickly went to fetch Wendy. Kiran helped treat Justin's injuries. After some acupuncture, Justin recovered about 50 to 60% of his strength and could walk independently. Lindsay soon came out with Wendy. She wore a long pink dress, looking delicate, beautiful, and pure. Wendy exuded a scholarly air, unlike modern women. If she were dressed in ancient attire, she would look like an ancient noble lady. During the day, Wendy appeared normal. Seeing Kiran's handsome face, she blushed and shyly lowered her head. Kiran felt a pang of sympathy for her, knowing the fate she faced. Let's set off now, Kiran said, turning to leave. Outside, someone had already sent a car for Lindsay. She had called her company to arrange it. Kiran drove as the four of them headed to Kiran Mountain. The atmosphere was heavy and silent during the drive. Wendy, looking at Kiran Mountain, grew increasingly nervous and pale. Justin sat beside Wendy, highly tense, fearing she might suddenly act out. Lindsay, in the front passenger seat, kept glancing at Kiran and then at Wendy, worried something might happen. Only Kiran remained calm, knowing the ghost fetus had endured so long to revive that it would tolerate anything to see it through. Just as Kiran predicted, despite Wendy's strong aversion to going to Kiran Mountain and her heightened alertness, she did not act out. When they arrived at Kiran Mountain, it was closed to visitors. Many people were turned away at the entrance. After parking, the four walked toward Kiran Mountain. Seeing them head up the mountain, the crowd blocked below began to complain and demand entry as well. The security guards were about to stop them but were intimidated by Kiran and didn't dare intervene. Ignoring the guards, Kiran led Justin and the others up the mountain, causing further uproar among the crowd. The anxious security guards quickly reported to Dale Murphy, who in turn informed Byron Murphy. Hearing that Kiran had brought people up the mountain, Byron hurried from his home to stop them. Chapter 868. Inside the Great Hall. As soon as Kiran York and the others entered, Wendy Kruger's body began to tremble violently. Justin Kruger supported his granddaughter, his expression becoming very serious. The stench of the python's corpse wafting from underground completely dispelled the original solemnity of the hall, replacing it with a bloody atmosphere. Justin glanced around, his expression becoming extremely grave. This python seems to have been raised for many years. I suspect Byron Murphy found it somewhere and has been raising it here for years, Kiran said to Justin. I don't know where the python came from. Justin shook his head. I know you're curious about Byron's martial arts, but his current abilities far exceed those of me and our master. After a moment of contemplation, Justin continued, I even suspect he had some extraordinary encounter in Sunland. Otherwise, how could his martial arts have become so advanced? You're saying Byron's abilities now far surpass yours and your master's, right? Kiran confirmed. Justin nodded. It seems Byron is indeed a martial arts prodigy and had a fortuitous encounter in Sunland, Kiran concluded, his expression turning serious. But the ninjas of Sunland are weaklings. How did he manage it? Justin remained silent, indicating he didn't know. Kiran's gaze shifted to Wendy, who was trembling like ocean waves were battering her. Her face was deathly pale, her lips bitten in an effort to control her fear. Kiran was puzzled and curious about the Great Hall. He examined it closely, noticing that unlike other temples which typically enshrine Buddha or Guanyin, this hall had an ambiguous figure that was neither male nor female, dressed oddly. The figure's eyes were incredibly vivid, seemingly full of life, almost like a natural person's eyes. When Kiran's gaze met those eyes, a beam of light shot through, making the eyes appear to move, even showing a hint of a smile. Kiran was startled, feeling as if he had seen a ghost in broad daylight. This doesn't seem like a deity worshipped in Dragon's Land, Lindsay commented. Kiran didn't respond, but glanced at Lindsay. Thinking Kiran didn't believe her, Lindsay quickly explained, "I've been burning incense and praying a lot lately, so I've seen many temples." "You've been burning incense and praying?" Kiran asked, surprised, looking at Lindsay. Her face turned red, and she glared at Kiran as if to say he was clueless. Kiran understood that Lindsay was praying for them to be together. He didn't tease her further and looked back at Wendy. He noticed that Wendy's eyes bore a resemblance to those of the statue, shocking him even more. Justin's expression was also grave, maintaining high vigilance. From the moment they entered, he felt that some of the auras in the temple were very similar to Wendy's. He assumed it was because the ghost fetus inside Wendy had been absorbing the incense from here for years. Could this statue be the prototype of the ghost fetus? Kiran asked Justin. Justin was taken aback, quickly looking at Kiran. "What kind of monster is this?" Kiran examined the statue and said, "It's not really a monster. It's probably a deceased person enshrined here and made to look like a statue." Justin and Lindsay trembled slightly, clearly terrified by this notion. Kiran walked over to Justin and pulled Wendy closer. Wendy cried out in fear, her face full of anxiety as she looked at Kiran. Without saying a word, Kiran dragged Wendy toward the statue. Wendy seemed to have a natural aversion and fear of the statue, continuously trying to retreat. The more she resisted, the more Kiran believed that the statue was indeed related to the ghost fetus inside her. At this moment, Wendy's fear was likely due to the many years she had coexisted with the ghost fetus, making her instinctively afraid. Seeing a glimmer of hope, Kiran pulled Wendy closer to the statue. Wendy suddenly covered her head with her hands and screamed. At that moment, she resembled a madwoman, utterly devoid of the scholarly aura she had previously exuded. Kiran was even more convinced. He forcefully held Wendy and made her look at the statue, loudly asking, "Are you afraid of this person?" Wendy's body shook violently as if blown by a fierce wind. She shook her head desperately, trying to escape. Her profound fear caused her to lose control of her bodily functions. Lindsay stood behind them, horrified by what she saw. Kiran ignored everything else and continued to make Wendy face the statue. His gaze was fixed on Wendy's eyes. Initially, Wendy's eyes were somewhat clear, but soon they became cloudy. Overwhelmed by fear, tears streamed down her face. "No, don't hurt me," Wendy whimpered, her emotions finally breaking down. Although it was just a few words, they sounded like the most heart-wrenching and fearful plea in the world to Kiran and the others. Even Kiran, a man, couldn't help but feel uncomfortable hearing it. Lindsay instinctively hugged herself tightly to fend off the chill. "Don't you want to come out and live?" Kiran asked, looking at Wendy. Wendy shook her head desperately, seemingly wanting to agree but unable to control her emotions. "Come out. This is your true form." "You can see everything clearly if you do," Kiran said softly to Wendy. Wendy's body trembled as if a storm was raging inside her, and she began to tear at herself and bite wildly, trying to break free from Kiran's grip. Kiran gently pressed Spot on Wendy's back and said, "Come out now, or you will die." His voice was soft, like coaxing a child. Wendy's struggles began to lessen, and her body began to emit an object from within. Kiran watched with anticipation. If the ghost fetus came out now, Wendy might have a chance to live. "You're courting death, Kiran York." Suddenly, Byron's angry shout echoed from the doorway. Chapter 869. The ghost fetus, which had already come halfway out, shrank back in fright at the sound of the shout. Kiran York's face showed disappointment, quickly followed by anger as he turned to look at Byron Murphy entering through the door. Justin Kruger stepped forward to block him. "Byron Murphy, what do you want?" "Senior brother, this is between Kiran and me. It has nothing to do with you," Byron said, trying to control his anger as he looked at Justin. Justin's face darkened and he said coldly, "My granddaughter is sick and Kiran is helping treat her. Please do not interfere." "Kiran is helping treat her? Ha!" Byron sneered, clearly disdainful and unbelieving. Justin's expression grew even darker as he stared at Byron. "Leave now." Byron's face showed arrogance and indifference. "Justin Kruger, this is Kiran Mountain, and everything here belongs to the Murphy family. What right do you have to tell me to leave?" Hearing Byron address him by his full name without any respect, Justin grew furious and reprimanded, "Byron Murphy, how dare you speak to me in such a tone?" Byron sneered, curling his lips. "If I don't use this tone, what tone should I use?" He looked at Justin coldly. "Calling you senior brother is out of respect. Otherwise, there is no connection between us." Justin had not expected Byron to be so heartless. Remembering how Byron had persuaded him to agree to his son's marriage, which led to his son's death, made his anger surge. "Byron Murphy, you are too arrogant." Byron laughed mockingly. "I have every right to be arrogant." He looked at Justin disdainfully. Our family is thriving, unlike yours, Justin. Our family is wealthy, unlike yours. As for my martial arts, I can kill you in seconds. How can you compare? You're just an old man hanging by a thread, not even worth a dog in my eyes. Calling you senior brother is a respect you don't deserve. Don't blame me for not showing any." Byron's words cut deep, and Justin's face turned livid as his body trembled with rage. He had never imagined Byron would be so ruthless and add salt to the wound, especially with Wendy Kruger's life hanging in the balance. His finger pointed shakily at Byron, unable to speak from the fury. Slap! Byron raised his hand and struck Justin. Justin's body spun several times before stopping. Byron ignored him, arrogantly approaching Kiran and Wendy. Byron looked at Kiran and sneered, "Did Kosner Aoki die yesterday?" His tone was domineering, cold, and merciless. Kiran's eyes narrowed as he watched Byron. Byron, unafraid of Kiran's gaze, sneered, "Kiran, if you hadn't seen me, you might have lived a good life. But now that you've seen me, you're dead." Kiran said nothing, releasing Wendy. She quickly backed away from the statue. Byron mistook Kiran's silence for fear. "Kiran, you know you're not my match." Kiran still said nothing, just watching Byron. "Do you have any last words?" "Say them now," Byron said arrogantly. "My only last words are kill your entire family." Kiran responded coldly. Byron laughed fearlessly. He stepped forward swiftly and struck at Kiran with a powerful palm. "With what?" The hall echoed with Byron's confident and authoritative shout as his palm struck toward Kiran. Kiran met the attack head-on. A loud sound echoed as their blows collided. Byron's ghost shadow palm struck Kiran's fists, causing a slight sting. Kiran saw black poison on his hands and shook them to expel it. Byron nodded slightly, impressed. "Kiran, your skills are beyond my expectations." "You've said that before. No need for more words," Kiran retorted, launching a counterattack. Byron sidestepped, avoiding Kiran's attack, and struck back. Kiran didn't resist but was knocked back. Trying to escape? Dream on. Byron, confident from his earlier success, chased after Kiran. Kiran retreated quickly. Lindsay watched anxiously, thinking Kiran was losing to Byron. Justin was puzzled, wondering why Kiran wasn't fighting back with full strength. Thud! Kiran's retreat caused him to crash into a small statue beside the main one. "Ouch!" Kiran cried out in pain, clutching his back and waist as if severely injured. Byron, initially angry about the damaged statue, felt pleased seeing Kiran's pain. "Kiran, you arrogant waste, today you'll die and accompany the python." Byron struck at Kiran again. Kiran dodged, knocking over another small statue. Kiran's repeated evasions damaged 2 of the 3 statues in the hall. Byron's face was cold with anger. Kiran, seemingly struggling, kept his eyes on the large statue, feeling a surge of joy. He was acting, trying to find a way to damage the main statue. Byron, unaware of Kiran's plan, grew increasingly frustrated. "Kiran, a small fry like you trying to stop me is laughable." He attacked again, aiming to kill Kiran on the spot. Kiran continued to dodge, circling the large statue. Worried Kiran might damage the statue, Byron hesitated, restraining his attacks. They played a cat-and-mouse game around the statue. Byron appeared confident of his victory, while Kiran seemed battered but increasingly joyful, focusing on the base of the statue. He was looking for a way to damage it. Byron, unaware of Kiran's intention, couldn't catch him and grew furious. "Kiran, today you must die." Byron's hands moved in a sweeping motion, autumn wind sweeping the fallen leaves. Debris from the broken statues flew towards Kiran. Kiran stepped on the base of the large statue with his right foot, causing a loud thud. Chapter 870. Crashing sounds echoed as fragments struck the large statue of Buddha. Creak, creak. It sounded as if a door beneath the statue was opening, making a dull noise. The statue began to tip forward slowly. Byron Murphy, who had been arrogant and confident, now looked anxious, as if a priceless treasure was about to be destroyed. He quickly withdrew his attacking palms and rushed forward to stabilize the statue. Kiran York's face showed a cold smile. "Byron, you fell into my trap!" With that, Kiran raised his palm and struck the back of the statue. The crisp sound of the blow reverberated, and the golden Buddha statue trembled as if hit by an earthquake, heavily tilting towards Byron. Byron, already struggling to support the statue, was caught off guard and knocked backward by the impact. The statue accelerated as it fell to the ground. Seeing the statue about to topple, Byron's face filled with panic. He desperately tried to push it back up with another palm strike, hoping to stabilize it. Kiran took a deep breath, leaped up, and forcefully kicked the Buddha's head. Crack! The sound resembled the snapping of bones. Byron's mind buzzed as he looked at the Buddha's head. The head was decapitated and hurtling towards him. Terrified, Byron let go and jumped aside to avoid being crushed. With a loud thud, the Buddha's head hit the ground but didn't shatter. Ah. Standing nearby, Wendy Kruger clutched her head and collapsed to the ground, screaming. It was as if her own head had fallen off, causing her unbearable pain. Boom. Accompanied by a loud noise, the statue's body crashed to the floor, creating a large pit. The statue shattered into pieces under the external force and Kiran's attack. Dust filled the great hall, which now felt eerie and cold, like entering a Hell King's palace of the underworld. Everyone shivered involuntarily. Justin Kruger paused momentarily before helping his granddaughter. Kiran jumped over to Lindsay Ludwig and shielded her behind him. Lindsay instinctively hugged Kiran's waist, seeking comfort. Byron glared at Kiran, then at the shattered statue on the ground, filled with anger and confusion. As the dust settled, the ground revealed fragments of the statue scattered everywhere. Inside the Buddha were many yellow talismans, some golden, some white, and some even black. Seeing the talismans, Justin's face changed several times. He looked at Byron and angrily asked, "Why are there Yang gathering talismans in there?" Byron, also furious, glared at Kiran and coldly said, "You're like a cockroach." "Why don't you just call me a jinx?" Kiran's attention was on the Buddha's head. Although the statue had shattered, the head remained intact. "Kiran, you killed the python and destroyed the Buddha." "I will kill you," Byron said furiously as if avenging a family member. Kiran ignored him, gently freeing himself from Lindsay's grip, and approached the Buddha's head. Byron didn't care about Kiran's movements, thinking the Buddha's head was now useless. As Kiran walked, his expression grew more serious, sensing an evil force emanating from the head. He quickened his pace, leaping towards the Buddha's head. Ha ha ha. The face-down Buddha's head suddenly let out a sinister laugh. The chilling laugh added to the eerie atmosphere of the hall, making even Byron step back in shock. The head began to move on its own, flipping over with a loud snap. The eyes, which had made Kiran uncomfortable, blinked twice as if greeting him. Everyone was terrified as if they had seen a ghost. "You troublesome head, still causing trouble?" Kiran shouted, raising his foot to stomp on it. "Hey!" Head let out another string of laughter and then suddenly vanished. Kiran's foot hit empty air and he wobbled, quickly looking around but finding no trace of it. Justin was holding Wendy, whose head was bleeding. Byron, seeing the Buddha's head vanish, felt a glimmer of hope. He struck at Kiran, trying to kill him with a sneak attack. Kiran dodged quickly. Byron's palm hit the air, but he swiftly moved to the scattered talismans. He exerted strength with both hands, and a force circulated through his palms. Gathering the talismans with his hands, he turned to flee. Wendy screamed in agony, her body trembling violently as if a new life was emerging from her. "Ah, if the ghost fetus absorbs the Yang energy, it will truly revive," Justin said anxiously to Kiran. Kiran understood the talisman's function. He glanced around the hall and said to Justin and Lindsay, "Let's go." He picked up Lindsay and headed towards Kiran Cave. Justin, not knowing where Kiran was going, followed closely behind. Lindsay, carried by Kiran, felt very happy and content. Byron had already taken Wendy into Kiran Cave. As they entered, the cold air inside made it feel like hell. He took a deep breath to calm down and saw the Buddha's head floating like a headless ghost searching around. Byron dropped Wendy, clutching the talismans, and ran towards the black coffin. The floating head, seeing the talismans, moved towards them like a baby seeing its mother's milk. Byron, filled with urgency, rushed to the black coffin, raising his hand to open it.